Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily video update for November 3rd, 2022. Yesterday was a fairly extraordinary day in that the Russian government called out the United Kingdom war hawks and put them on the spot for their recent actions, which have been moving the world toward an accelerated confrontation over Ukraine that could develop into a Russia versus NATO war that could go possibly nuclear. The Russians took steps to begin an exit from the highway to war. There were three things that came up of most importance, which have not really been covered at all in the Western press, not surprisingly, given the nature of the hybrid warfare which is being conducted by the British, NATO, and Americans to heighten the tension, but also to keep the populations of those countries unaware of the drift, or I should say the rush, toward a bigger war. The first was a call issued for the Nuclear Five, which is the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Russia, and China, to restate their commitment to the statement they jointly released on January 3rd, 2022, which said, quote, "We affirm that a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought," unquote. This was first adopted as a policy during a summit of Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev in 1985. The Russians announced yesterday they, quote, "fully reaffirm our commitment to the joint statement," unquote. And they called upon the other four members of the Nuclear Five to reaffirm their commitment. This occurs as there's been much loose talks, especially from the United States, the British, and some NATO officials, that Russia is preparing to resort to the use of nuclear weapons in Ukraine, supposedly because they're losing the war. Well, the Russians are not losing the war. The war is continuing largely because NATO won't let it be stopped. And so as the talk of Russian nuclear threats proliferates in the Western media, it's actually the Western leaders that are discussing the possibility of a preemptive strike. And the Russians have put forward this call as a positive, serious step away from that to diffuse the tension. The question is, will the leaders of the other Nuclear Five respond to this? Now remember, it was Zelensky who asked for nuclear weapons for Ukraine at the Munich Security Conference earlier this year. And then more recently, he called for a preemptive nuclear strike on Russia to prevent a nuclear strike. A preemptive strike using nuclear weapons to stop a nuclear war doesn't make sense, does it? It's typical. Now, also keep in mind that the United States has recently changed its nuclear posture, as indicated by the recent National Security Declaration, which said that there are circumstances where the U.S. would use preemptive nuclear strikes. So this is a change in policy, but it's the direction that we've seen in recent security documents that have called on the United States to prepare for so-called great power challenges. Now, the second development was Maria Zakharova, the Russian Foreign Ministry spokeswoman, announced that the British ambassador to Moscow will be summoned to the Foreign Ministry to answer charges related to the Sevastopol drone attacks on October 29th and the explosions on the Nord Sea pipelines. The Russians now claim they have evidence of a clear British hand in both of these. And this evidence was presented at a closed-door session of the UN Security Council on October 31st. The Russians wouldn't say they have evidence without actually having evidence. The question is, what will the response be? So far, we've seen the ducking that's typical of governments caught when lying. The British, for example, said Russia is, quote, peddling false claims of an epic scale, unquote. Well, the British would know about peddling false claims. Keep in mind that it was Richard Dearlove of MI6 and Tony Blair that went to Bush in 2002, 2003, claiming they had evidence of Saddam Hussein's weapons of mass destruction program, which led to the destructive genocidal war against Iraq. They did the same thing again on Gaddafi, saying that Gaddafi was about to slaughter his population, leading to a NATO-US intervention, which ended up overturning the government and destroying the nation of Libya. Also, the lies on chemical weapons use allegedly by the Assad government in Syria, which has been thoroughly discredited by investigations. So the British know something about lies for the sake of war. So their response should be taken with a huge grain of salt. And we'll see what happens when the British ambassador goes to meet with the Russians to explain how the Russians have this evidence and what it means. Now, from the US, there was no direct response, except the surfacing of nuclear-armed ballistic missile submarines on October 19th in the Arabian Sea, the USS West Virginia, and then on November 1st, the USS Rhode Island at Gibraltar. The U.S. commander of the nuclear fleet in Gibraltar described this as continuing the, quote, strong history of cooperation, unquote, of U.S.-UK forces. Now, usually submarines are kept under the water as a secret capability as part of the nuclear triad. Why have two of them surface near Europe within 2 weeks if this is not a message to the Russians? Now, the third case is the Russians yesterday announced that they will resume the grain shipments through the Black Sea. These were halted following the drone attack on Sevastopol, and they now say that Kiev has provided a written assurance that they will allow safe passage of these ships through the Black Sea. Well, so much for the farcical claim of the Secretary of State Blinken that the temporary shutdown by the Russians following the drone attacks was an example of Russia weaponizing food. In fact, Ukraine had signed an assurance of safe passage, which was then violated by the drone attacks. Now, they've signed a new assurance. We'll see whether this one holds. Remember Minsk II? Given the record of Ukraine recently, it's not 100% certain that they will stick to this agreement. So the Brits are under pressure. This is an extremely important shift in Russian policy, where they're pulling together evidence to prove their claims that it's the British who are the driving force of the Ukraine war, and they're acting in conjunction with the U.S. commitment to weaken or bleed Russia dry as a result of the opposition to Russia's moves to break with the unipolar system. It's clear Britain is under enormous pressure. There's been little coverage in the Western press of what I just reported. But this comes as the United Kingdom is in a very deep crisis. Obviously, they're looking to change the subject, and war is often the choice. It's typical of hybrid warfare. You lie to the population about what's actually happening. You promote the idea of the great virtue of the UK government in defending the so-called freedom of the Ukrainians, who are not free at all. They're essentially being deployed as a battering ram against Russia, with great casualties for Ukraine. And the crisis is continuing in the United Kingdom. People are suffering there due to the economic chaos unleashed by the neoliberal ideologues who are running the country. And keep in mind, the dumping of Liz Truss was facilitated by actions of the Bank of England acting on behalf of the City of London. It shows who's making policy in the UK, and it's not the people. So much for the idea of a democratic monarchy. Now you have Sunak as the latest puppet. He reaffirmed the Bojo Truss policy of continuing the war in Ukraine. He's doubling down on austerity, and he has a hands-off policy on the energy and financial speculators of the City of London, Rotterdam, and elsewhere who have wrecked the British economy thanks to the policies of deregulation and privatization, which Sunak claims is the solution rather than the cause of the problem. And these are the policies pushed by the World Economic Forum and the financial cartels as part of the Great Reset. So it's essential that these policies be changed. Now, toward this end, the Schiller Institute has had 2 conferences with former and current elected officials and other social leaders, which has issued a declaration. And I'm going to read the declaration to you. We call on people of goodwill around the world, notwithstanding our diverse and natural differences, to participate in this process of deliberation and search for peaceful solutions, including a thorough examination of the alternative economic policies to replace speculation, which has generated so much poverty and suffering, with a system of production and progress to meet the needs of a growing world population. This grouping will be sponsoring another conference by the Schiller Institute on November 22nd, and there's a link to register for it on the bottom of the description page. I would urge people to sign up and to read through what we've produced on the LaRouche Organization website about these conferences to get a sense that there are people in the world moving toward a solution, a new financial and security architecture. And these 3 Russian developments, which I reported today, are coherent with this drive toward a peaceful resolution of the Ukrainian war. Tomorrow's Friday. I'll take your questions. Send them to me at harleysch@gmail.com. Thanks for joining me. See you tomorrow.